Okay, we're back and ready to continue with our project. Alright, what we're going to do is some material work. We're going to make our cube a lot more interesting, visually speaking, and here's how we're going to do it. I'm going to start off by taking my cube and just, you'll notice that its translates, because of the way we grouped it, are at 0, 0, 0, and that's pretty convenient for us. I'm just going to lift it up into the air, and that's really just so that I can rotate around it and still leave the floor in the scene, which will be important a little bit later. Now, we need to create a new material, and we're going to start off by creating our materials the old-fashioned way. And then when we get to creating a material for our floor object, we'll do it the new way with the node editor. So you will get some exposure to the new node editor system in Maya 2013, which is amazing, just so you know. Now, let's go to Window, Rendering Editors, and open up the Hypershade. Actually, you know what, guys? I'm sorry. I don't want to backtrack or jump around too much, but I just realized there is something on my notes that we didn't yet get a chance to talk about that I've got to squeeze in before we go too much further. I absolutely must. There's no choice in the matter, and I am sorry for having to take a quick diversion. But I need to talk to you guys a little bit about construction history and the concept of nodes inside of Maya. And to really show those off, I need to make another cube. So here's the way I'm going to do this. I'm just going to click on my cube button, X and Shift, and make another one which is very much like the one that we had before. So I have these two cubes, one that has been modeled and one that hasn't. So let's grab both of these, and I want to isolate select so that this is all we're really looking at. Now with this cube selected, and this is just one object, you understand, it's just a cube, I'm going to go to Window, and we'll go back to the hypergraph, but where we've been looking at the scene hierarchy, which is one of the graphs in Maya, we're now going to look at the other graph, which is our connections. I'll go ahead and pull this up into view. Now, this is interesting, because what this is doing is showing us all of the different nodes that are making what we see possible. And there's even an extra node here that we wouldn't have if we weren't doing isolate select. So if I were to close this and get out of isolate select mode and then just grab this guy again and go to Window, Hypergraph Connections, this is actually closer to what I really want you to see. Okay? Now, if I jump back over to Photoshop real quick, and let's see, I think we can make this space work. What we see in our scene is this little cube. But this cube, like every object in Maya, is the result of a series of nodes. So what I want to do is show you the default nodes that are created when you make a new object, so you're familiar with those. We're going to talk about some of the nodes that are created while you perform other operations on an object. And then we're going to talk about how that becomes construction history and how deleting history can be beneficial to you. So, starting from scratch, or from the beginning, when you create a new object, a really nice analogy for how nodes work in Maya is like construction. And not just because they use the term construction history, but there really is a real-world analogy that works pretty well here. This cube that we created is actually the result of 4 nodes. And there's just a 4th one which isn't really attached to anybody. These are the input node, the shape node, the shading group node, and the transform node. And each one of these nodes performs a very specific job to create this object. The input node you can think of like the blueprints, and this is all tying into this construction analogy. The shape node is kind of like the object itself once constructed. So this is kind of like your brick and mortar. Your shading group is pretty much the paint and what the surface looks like. And then your transform is going to be where this is placed, or its position. So think of this kind of like building modular homes, where the whole thing is built at a factory somewhere and then shipped off to some location. And that's exactly what Maya is doing. It has the input node, which produces what the object should look like and contains all of the data for how the object should be created. All of that information is fed into the shape node to actually create the object. The shape node is responsible for storing all of the vertices, all the vertex information, and all of the internal features that make that object what it is. The shading group controls the renderable surface of that object, how shiny it is, what color it is, etc. And then the transform node will position it somewhere in our 3D scene. Now, a couple of things about this. The only reason we're able to see these nodes is because we are looking at the second of Maya's two graphs. We've already been looking at one of them today several times. The first one is the scene hierarchy. Which literally just shows you all of the objects in the scene and how they relate to each other in terms of parenting relationships. The second graph is this new one we're looking at, and this is known as the DAG, or the Directed Acyclic Graph. It is directed because the flow of information generally moves only in one direction. Not two ways, but only one way. It's acyclic because you can't have a cycle, meaning, and then I'm just going to keep this very general. I got a little carried away with this in the previous class where I tried to teach this, but we'll keep it very, very basic. If I have two spheres in my scene, and I tell the translate y, which moves up and down, by the way, if I tell the translate y of this sphere to affect the translate y of this sphere, that's fine. That means when I move this sphere up, this one will move up too, which is great. But if I then tell the translate y of this sphere to go back and affect this one, we have a problem because that's a cycle, and Maya will not like that. And it still does look like glasses, I know, at least for a minute. That's because Maya's architecture is acyclic. It doesn't like cyclic relationships, and it will start to act funny if you create one even by accident. So again, this is the DAG, and this is where all of the nodes that make up an object are visible. And it is different from the scene hierarchy, which shows you all of the objects themselves and how they relate to one another. So does everybody understand that? And you can access both of these by way of window, hypergraph. For the hierarchy, that's the scene hierarchy, shows all the objects in the scene and their relationships. And then the hypergraph, which shows all of the connections between the nodes that make up an individual object. Now, if we take a look at this cube has been modeled, and it has had a lot of different operations performed to it. So let's go to Window and check out its connections. We still have the original input node, but then we have our first extrusion, our second extrusion, our first bevel, our second bevel, then we have our shape node, and then our shading group, and then there's our transform node floating out there in space. Notice that all of these operations have been stored as an individual node. Why is that important? Well, that's due to the idea of construction history, where all of these operations are stored as nodes, and we have access to them if we want to change anything about them. For instance, if I grab this guy, and I'm going to set him over onto isolate select just for a moment, so we can just focus on him. Let's go to that first extrusion that we did, poly extrude face 1. Remember, all that was an inset. We took local scale and set that to 0.7. What if we decided that that made all of our little indentations a little bit too small? We can select local scale X, Y, and Z, and now use our middle mouse button to adjust those. And the entire shape will update as if we had made the extrusion that size to begin with. That's the very nature of construction history, the ability to step back in time and change certain decisions that we made to reflect new ideas, to update our object. It is not foolproof. The reason it's not foolproof is that every single vertex on this object, every single edge, every single face, they all have an ID number. Maya uses those ID numbers to figure out what you should be doing at, or how each one of these things should be constructed. So for instance, if I go to, let's say we go all the way back to the polycube, we have subdivisions width, height, and depth. Watch what happens if I increase those. We get a really weird result. And all because all of the subsequent operations that were performed on that object were based off of those IDs. As we add more vertices to the object, those IDs are all updating. So now it looks like different faces were being extruded and beveled. And you got to keep that in mind. However, as long as you're not actually changing the number of vertices on an object, you do have a lot of control here. For instance, we could take the width, height, and depth and increase or decrease that, or maybe just one of them. We can go all the way back to one of our bevels and readjust the offset to it to tighten that up or make it a little looser as we need to. So it's very, very handy. Now that's the benefit of construction history. And again, that's what this is called. This kind of gathering of nodes, the way these nodes are kind of piling up. This is referred to as construction history. That's why it's useful. Can anybody tell me why this might be problematic? Anybody? Want to just fancy a guess? It will bog down. Maya can crash. That's right. You can eventually run out of memory if you have too much construction history going on in your scene. And you have to be selective. Some operations that you'll perform when you get deeper into using Maya, such as skinning a character, are history dependent, and you can't get rid of those as much as you might like to. However, in this case, all we have is different modeling options. When we are done with the modeling process, it would probably be a good idea to go ahead and cancel out all of our construction history, basically to erase it. So that's what we're going to do. Now, I'm going to take, before I do this, I'm going to take the segments of this first bevel that I created, and I'm going to kick those to an odd number. In fact, I don't want to go all the way up to an even number, just so I have a nice edge right in the middle. I don't really want to kick it all the way up to 4, so I'm going to compromise and let it go all the way down to 2. It'll make the object simpler anyway, which is fine with me. If you don't want to do that, that's fine. But that's just what I'm going to do so that I have a nice center line so I can put different colors on each side of the box without having to have an empty face in the middle that might have to be colored white. Though you could certainly do that if you wanted to. Okay, so when you're finished modeling an object and you want to re-optimize your scene, it's a good idea to delete your history. And this is done by going under Edit, Delete by Type, History. Notice all those nodes are now gone. Now, it wasn't necessary, the history itself was deleted, but of course, since the object has retained its shape, all of that information wasn't lost. What has happened is that all of the information prior to the input node, and in the case of this cube, we had our input, we had an extrusion, we had another extrusion, we had a bevel, and another bevel, and those were all connected before we made it to the shape node. So those are all strung together in order, and then we went to the shape node. When we delete history, what happens is all of this information that is plugged into the shape node is gathered up and recorded into the shape node. So we don't even need it anymore. This is just like when you finish building something, like a building or an apartment complex or whatever it is you need to build that requires blueprints. When you're done, you can throw the blueprints away, because at that point, you've already got the object completed. And then all you have left is just the shape node, the shading group, and the transform. So if we go back over to Maya, select our object and go to Window, back down to the hypergraph connections, you'll see we still see the model panel. That's just because we have isolate select on. But we have our shape node, we have our shading group, and we have our transform node. Pretty straightforward. Does that make sense to everybody? Good! As feedback and interaction becomes fewer and fewer as people trickle out and have to go home and commence with their real lives, which I totally understand. All right, so now let's go ahead and create some materials for our block. So I'm going to go to Window, actually let's close this out, Window, Rendering Editors, and open up the Hypershade. Now, I would like this material, or the materials that we'll be using, to be kind of shiny. And I will give you kind of heads up. I will be doing this in a very simplified manner. You may or may not want to, like later on, you'll find there are a lot of ways to handle what it is I'm about to be doing. But we're going to do this in a very simplified way. We are going to create 7 different materials to go on the sides of this block. One for each side, a different color. And then we'll create a white base. Actually, I think I might start with a white base first. So for now, I just want to see the work area. So here in the hypershade, let's make the hypershade nice and big so everybody can see it. And I don't really need much in terms of the upper area, so I'll just expand out the work area a little bit. And we'll crush this list down. Let's make a Fong. Render-wise, it's a very simple material. Let's right-click, or hold in the right mouse button and choose Rename, and we'll call this block underscore, or actually, let me start with matte, so that'll be our naming convention. So material underscore block underscore white base. So we know it's a material, we know it's for the block, and there's its name, white base. Now, watch this. I'm just going to select this guy and hit Control-D and duplicate it. Right-click and rename. Instead of white base, this will be red. Control-D, and we'll zoom out just a little bit. Rename, and this will be blue. Control-D, rename, and I don't care what colors you use. You can use any color in the rainbow, whatever makes you happy. Green, Control-D, rename. This will be, I don't know, yellow. Rename, and this one will be, wow, I think I killed out too much of the name there. So rename, and let's just change this to orange. And Control-D one more time, and we'll make this one purple. So we have 6 colors plus white. Weird, my work area is empty. Nothing shows up when I drag into it. Are you middle mouse dragging? Richard asked way earlier, make sure you're middle mouse dragging. Way earlier you asked what the group options were. Pretty easy. If you go to Edit and jump over to Group and open up the options box, the only thing I really wanted you to do was make sure the pivot was in the center. If you forgot to do that and you've already created your group, you can just select your group and go to Modify and choose Center Pivot, and that'll do the same thing. So it's just one less step. Okay, so let's just start here with white. I'm going to make my hypershade just a little bit smaller. And that doesn't work, does it? Let's open up our attribute editor, which of course you either have a tab for it, you can click the attribute editor button over here on the interface. And if you want to make something white in Maya, there's a really quick and easy way to do it. In this case, of course, all you have to do is just drag the slider all the way to the right, and that'll be fine. You have a few other sliders you can play with, and I'm going to leave this entirely up to you. You have things like the cosine power, which is going to control the tightness of your specular highlight, and you have the specular color, which will just control how intense the shine is on that object. Play with that to your heart's content. Do, however, keep this in mind. By default, and I do not understand why Maya has done this, all materials you create will have a reflectivity of 0.5, meaning they are 50% mirrored. We don't need that for the blocks. We're going to turn that all the way down to 0. You'll do that for everybody. So let's switch over to matte block red, and I'll start off by taking my diffuse color. Just click on the color swatch, and we'll just set this to some shade of red. I generally like to desaturate just a little bit. I try not to use full bright colors whenever I can remember to. And we'll pull the specular color down just a little bit and turn off our reflectivity. Go down to blue and repeat the process. There's a pretty nice blue. Again, make sure reflectivity is all the way at 0. Now this one's green. Looks pretty good. Then yellow. Again, don't forget that reflectivity. You've got 7 different materials to pay attention to, so easy to overlook. And finally we have purple. Okay, so what I want to do is double check anybody who's still following along. Just update your ready status to let me know that you've got all of your materials all set up. Oh, NATO. No worries, man. If you need to duck out, that's totally cool. Alright, so now it's time to go ahead and get these applied. So here's how we're going to do this. Let's start out with just the letters. And the letters will each get a color, and I don't really care what color you assign to each one. So you can just middle mouse drag one color onto each letter. And now is when stuff starts to get fancy. Because now we need to assign a whole bunch of different colors to our block. And here's how we're going to do that. First off, I want you to right-click on this block, hold down the right mouse button, and choose Faces. One of the great things about Maya is that you can select faces and assign materials directly to those specific faces. So I want you to select all of the inset faces, all 6 of them, right mouse on the white base, and choose Assign Material to Selection. It's just above your right mouse button. Or I'm sorry, it's just above your cursor when you hold down the right mouse button. And that will assign your white. Now this will be a little bit more fun. So I'll start here with the red side for A. I'm going to grab the outside of the frame. Actually, you know what? Let me see if I can get a little fancy. What if I do this? I don't know if this is going to work, guys. So if it does, cool. If it doesn't, well, then there you go. Let me grab edges. And I'm going to double-click this innermost edge of the bevel. And then let's go out to this edge, which I'm double-clicking as well. And I've got to kind of march all the way around because Maya's not sure what constitutes an edge loop. Now, with those selected, I don't know if this will work, but I just want to try. Let's hold down Control and right mouse and go to Faces and choose to Contained Faces. That didn't work. I don't know if I just switch that to Faces. No, still not quite what I want. Alright, let's go back to the old way. I'll just switch over to Faces, grab all these guys, and then, oh, excuse me, we can hit Shift and the period key, and that will expand our selection slightly, but I want to be a little careful here, because on this edge, I don't want to go any further in this. Okay, I may just end up having to select by hand, and there's another way that might help me do that, and that is with paint selection. So I can click on this over here, and this just simply allows me to paint exactly what faces I want to select. Your brush may be really huge, though, like mine is. You can hold down the B key and then middle mouse drag and make your brush a lot smaller. And just carefully paint over the faces that you want. Now, you will have to paint near the center of a face to actually make it read, and that's just part of the way Maya works. So if you're having a hard time with the faces to actually pick up, it's just because you need to paint closer to their centers. If you need to unselect a face that you've painted, just hold down Control and paint back over it, and you can erase in that manner. So you notice I'm getting right up to the edges here on the outside, and then I'm going all the way to the white surface on the inside. You don't have to hit Shift, but you will need to hit Control to deselect. And just make sure I get these little corners here. And that all looks good. Once I have those, simply right mouse over here in the hypershade and choose Assign Material to Selection. And you can hit Q to get out of your Paint Select tool. Now I need to do that with the rest of the sides of my block. So I'm going to be a little bit quiet while I do that, but if you have any questions, just make sure you ask. So I'll just go back in here. Let's go back to Faces. I'm going to grab the Paint Select tool once again. I'll make my brush a little bigger. That's with the B and middle mouse once again. And I'll just start with the frame, because that's easy. And then I'll get the insides of the frame, because that's also very quick and easy, especially if you paint right down the center. I'm going to be a little selective about the outsides. It looks like I got to make my brush a little bit smaller so Maya will quit griping. And just be sure to catch those corners because they're easy to overlook. Now if you ended up with a different number of bevel divisions and you have like a central face, I would just make that central face white. Now can you select a face and then use the up and down arrows to select the whole row? I don't think Maya will agree with you on what means a row. I mean, you can give it a try, and if it works well for you, then kudos, but I don't see Maya really appreciating that the same way you do. Basically, what I'm getting at is the surface is so complex that it's probably not going to think of rows the same way you do. Let's see if I can get away with just shift clicking now. Just be careful and don't accidentally marquee select when you do that, because you'll end up selecting through and that'll be problematic, of course. Alright, once you got everybody, this will be yellow, so just right click, assign material to selection. Now I'm on green. I mean, I can do shift period and expand my selection out once and then just get the insides. That's a little faster. And there's green. Let's do blue. So again, I can just get the outer frame, shift period to expand out one good time, and then all I got to worry about is the insides. And sorry if I get a little quiet sometimes, I'm just focused on working through something as quick as I can. And this is purple, so right mouse, assign, and there we go. So we have our letter block all set up. Now I'm going to pause the video and give you just a second to catch up to this point as you need to. MMO Dust just asked if there was a way to spin around the cursor as opposed to the viewport. Not that I'm aware, but do keep in mind that you can select an object or a component such as a face and tap the F key and frame up on it, and then you're rotating around that one thing, and that's kind of nice. Yeah, I could tell you in Blender. Streeter, I didn't even know you were still here. You've been so quiet. Alright, it looks like we're pretty much ready to go ahead and continue. Let's go ahead and create a material now for our floor. And we're going to do this in a slightly more interesting way. We're going to use the brand new node editor for Maya 2013. So what I want you to do is go to Window and crack open the node editor. If you are not using Maya 2013, is that you, Raven? Are you still in Maya 2012? Is that why you're doing all this stuff? Oh. Well, then what's the problem? Oh, it's excitement. That doesn't look like excitement. That looks like, But, you know. Okay. Either way. This is really easy to use, but it's more helpful if you already have an understanding of what nodes you need. So don't be alarmed if you find yourself a little afraid of it at first and find yourself still using the hypershade and the hypergraph for a while until you get the swing of it. Here's what we got to do. First off, we need to make a material node. And it says press tab to create a node. Well, that's easy. Press the tab key. We are going to make, let's do another Phong. They're just so light on the system. So we'll do PHONG. And there's a Phong. Boom. Press enter. And we've made a Phong node. We've made some other things too. We have our shading group node, which is just connected. We don't need to worry about it, but there it is anyway. And let's go ahead and middle mouse drag this on top of our floor. And we can go ahead and rename this. So hold down the right mouse button and rename, and we'll call this mat_floor. Now, earlier I gave everybody a download link to a texture. Hopefully you still know generally where that is or where you saved it to. If you didn't, make sure that you can find that real quick because I'm going to be using it. And here's how we're going to do that. We're going to create another node, so hit the tab key and type File. And you should see File Texture. So click that and press enter. Just like with a hypershade, this brings in a Place 2D texture node along with your actual node that you're going to need. And we need to rename this as well. So hold on the right mouse button and rename. We'll call this text_floor. Alright, now we need to change some of the properties of this node. So if we double click it, that'll open up the attribute editor, which is fantastic. Next to image name here in the attribute editor, you can click on the little folder, and then you're going to have to kind of scoot around on your computer to find that texture that I gave everyone to download, which is just a big hunk of wood. I actually took this using a digital camera from a piece of furniture that Jason had sitting around the house. So there we go. Now, to make this attach to the color, it's pretty easy. All we do is take the out color connection, drag a wire over to color. And there you go. And if we take a look over here in the view, check it out. We have wood grain. It's amazing. Now, to make things look a little nicer, I'm going to grab my Place 2D texture node. We're going to take repeat U and V and set that to, let's try 3x3 and see how that looks. That's a little too repetitious. Let's try 2x2. That's not too bad. Maybe I can get away with 1.5 by 1.5. That looks a little better. It's still repeating, but there's still just enough wood there to see what's going on. Alright, now we're going to do something that is a little less automated because of the way we're doing it, but this is just for academic purposes anyway. I'm going to make a little bit of space right in between my file node and my floor material. And we'll hit tab, and I want you to make a bump 2D node. Press enter. Now, we're not going to worry about the out alpha in this case. We're going to be a little fancy. We're going to take our out color R, because this wood is mostly red, so a lot of the contrast in our color scheme is coming from the red channel. We're going to take out color R and plug that into bump depth. Actually, excuse me, strike that, delete that connection. We're going to plug that into bump value. Just kidding. Then once you've got that set up, take your out normal and plug that into the normal camera of your material. Now here's the deal. You've just built a bump map. It may not be visible in your viewport, and that's totally cool. If you want to, you can click the render button up here at the top in your status line, and you can see how that looks rendered. It's going to look really, really chunky. But I'm going to do something a little bit fancier. First off, I'm done with the node editor at this point. So I'll go ahead and give you guys just a second to catch up if you need it, so you can see kind of what's attached to where. Yeah, I'm sure my mic did just fizz a little bit when I rendered. I don't see all those attributes like you do. How do you switch between the modes? Good question. Each one of those nodes has a visibility status that you can click on, this little tiny icon up here in the corner. So you can have a condensed version, a mid version, which is just what you're actually using on it, and then the full version, which shows everything. So you just click between those. So when you're done, once you got everything hooked up, you can minimize everything down, and you can still visualize what's connected to what, but in a much simpler manner. Now, since I'm done with the node editor, let's close that out. I'm going to do something kind of fancy. You do not have to do this if you don't want to. If you can't do it, that's fine too. I'm going to open up Viewport 2.0. And we don't have any lights here, so let's create a light. I don't even know if this is going to work. I just want to try it. So let's go to Lights and make a point light. Alright, Viewport 2.0 does not like my texture. So let's try high quality rendering. Oh, that works. So with high quality rendering, and if I hit 7, we can see how that bump mapping is looking in real time. And it's looking really chunky and kind of horrible, to be honest. So let's fix that. We can go under our matte floor material. And there's our bump map right there. It says bump mapping is connected to text floor. Click on this little tiny black arrow. And that takes you out to the texture. And, well, if we hit the output connection here, there's our bump 2D node. If you're having a hard time finding it, you can always open your node editor back up and select it manually. You just need to be able to get to this bump 2D node. And take your bump depth, and you're going to set this way, way, way down. So try 0.01. I'm going to kick it up a little bit. Let's try 0.02. Oh, there you go. There's just a little bit of subtle wood grain. You can also try negative numbers. Sometimes it makes wood grains look a little more realistic if you're just using your color channel to make a bump. But look at that. I mean, isn't that great? You get a really nice looking bump right there on your wood surface. I loves it. Okay, now this light looks terrible, so I'm going to stop rendering through the light. I'm even going to turn off high quality. I mean, it looks great. We know it looks great. Let's delete out this light. It's just there for demonstration purposes. Now, let's grab our block. In fact, I want to make sure I grab the whole block, so I'll select by hierarchy like we were doing a minute ago. And I'm going to set its translate back down to 0 and slide it in Z toward the back of my table. Once I've done that, I'm going to hit Control D and duplicate it. We'll make another block up here at the front of the table. And I'll duplicate that and make another block. And I'm going to position these guys. So let's maybe rotate this one around to show the letter B. And we'll give it a little bit of a cool angle. And we'll rotate this one around so it'll be the letter C. And give it kind of an interesting angle. If you want to slide things around on the surface of the table, you can control-click on the Y-axis and then just move around to that little square in the middle. And put that right about there. And now we are actually set up for the scene that we want to do. Are you making a kindergarten? Well, I mean, kinda. We're just doing some little basic blocks. I figure you all are kind of like Maya infants anyway, so I'm giving you a project suitable for Maya infants. Now we get to have some fun, because we get to take a look at the concept of animation. Now, animation is fun in Maya. In fact, so far, I mean, it has a lot of things in common with Blender and with 3ds Max, but Maya's animation is just close to my heart, and I have a hard time getting away from that. So, let's go ahead and talk about how we're going to be animating this scene. The first thing I want you to do is to split up your view. We're going to do this manually. There's a couple of different ways to do it. We could do this using the hotbox, but I don't want to. I want you to see how to do this. Go under your panels menu for the viewport. Go underneath layouts and set your layout to 2 panes stacked. You're going to take this lower panel, go into the panels menu, go into the panel submenu, and choose the graph editor. Now, I do not have a whole lot of screen space. So anything that I am not going to use right now, I'm going to switch off just to let you guys see a little bit more of what's going on. So, let's say I don't need the help line anymore. I can right-click on this little dot pattern here on the left-hand side and turn off the help line. I don't need the mel command line, so we'll go ahead and turn off the command line. The range slider and the time slider will be useful, so I'll leave those in place. I do not need the toolbox, so I will turn off the toolbox. I'll go ahead and switch this back over to the channel box. I do not need the shelf, so I will right-click up here on this dot pattern and switch off the shelf. I like the status line, so I'll go ahead and leave that going for the time being. We'll pull this down a little bit, and now we can all see a little more clearly what's going on. Alright, so now we are finally ready to animate. And what we're going to do is animate one channel at a time to make this block at the back of the room bounce all the way forward. Now, before you do anything, here's a really, really good tip for you. File, save scene. Another really good tip that you should probably always use is if you go to save scene, you'll notice save actually has an options box. Turn on incremental saves and click save scene. What this means is every time you hit Control S, you'll get another version of your file, which is great if you break something and you have to go back to a previous version. It'll handle all that automatically for you, which is very cool. Yeah, it did take me this long to do that, Streeter, which the funny part is if I had to recreate this entire scene, it would only take me about 10 minutes to do if I wasn't actually teaching anything. Probably less than 10 minutes. I'd probably do it in 5. Okay, now, moving on from here, let's go ahead and set up our first animation. Now, the way I like to animate may not be the same way you do. I don't care. You're going to animate the way I want you to right now. I feel like such a jerk when I say that. Let's take the range slider. Take this inner field on the right-hand side and set this to, let's do 100 frames. Also, make sure that auto key is on. It will make things a lot easier as we move forward. The auto key is this little tiny button that looks like a key on the right-hand side. If it's on, it turns red, so that's how you know you're using auto key. Okay, now again, we're going to animate one channel at a time. We're just going to worry about animating our block moving forward through space, and then we'll worry about him jumping, and then we'll add some rotation just to make stuff a little more interesting in terms of, the visual aspect of stuff. So, the first thing I want you to do is drop in your first keyframe. You're going to do that by hitting Shift-W. All that does is that keyframe's translation. Now, another common way to keyframe is to hit the S key. That keyframes everything. I feel like that's wasteful and adds keyframes we don't need. We don't need to animate scale. We don't need to animate visibility and whatnot. So I just want to animate what we need. Remember the move tool was under W, the rotate tool is under E, and the scale tool is under R? Well, to animate move, hit Shift-W. To animate rotate, hit Shift-E. And to animate scale, hit Shift-R. Very, very easy to remember. So we have our first keyframe here at the back of our table. Now, I want you to go all the way to frame 90. I want you to slide the block all the way forward so it's sticking right through these blocks, and then pick it up and set it right on top of these blocks. And if you need to, jump over to an orthographic view, and I'll show you a nice quick way to do that. Hold down the space bar and just click on the word Maya and choose Side View. And that'll give you a nice orthographic view that you can use to place that block right on top. Once you're done, hold down spacebar again, click on the word Maya, and go back to your perspective view. Now if you take a look down here in the graph editor, you already have some animation curves, and what I want you to do is to mouse over the graph editor and tap the F key, and that will frame up on all of your animation curves. And I want everybody who is still following along to catch up to this point. Okay, so you've got your animation curves all set up. The way these work is these are graphing out the position, in this case, of your object over time. So we are starting at this location, and over time we're gradually moving to this other location. And the curve defines the nature of the motion, where in this case we're steadily speeding up and then slowing back down. Now, the funny thing is, if we drag the time slider, you see that we're kind of flying up to this point. That's not at all what we want to do. Also, I would like our forward momentum to be constant. I don't like this slowly accelerate and then slowly decelerate stuff. So, what I want you to do is grab your 2 keyframes for translate Z. Z is the axis we are moving forward in, hopefully. If you're animating in another axis by accident, if you're using X, then you'll just have to update your axes accordingly, and that's fine. But I'm animating forward in Z. So I'm going to take my 2 keyframes for my Z motion and click on the linear tangents button. It's right about dead center of the graph editor. Now what this means is our Z motion is constant. It neither accelerates nor decelerates. Now, if we take a look at our Y translate, so I'm just going to click on translate Y and then tap the F key, we have this steady rising wave. That's not very useful, because what we want to do is actually bounce this block. We want it to start here, and then bounce, bounce, and then land on top of all these blocks. So here's how we're going to do that. Each of our blocks is going to take about 30 frames. So I'm going to start off by going to frame 30, and I'm going to make sure that the translate Z of our block, that remember, actually, I'm sorry, no, forgive me, not translate Z, let's do translate Y, which is currently at 1 right now. We're going to set that to 0. A translate Y of 0 will set that object, set that block back down on the table. Watch very closely the curve when I set this to 0, and then watch the block as well. So I'll undo one more time. This time look at the block. I set it to 0. The block sets down back on the table. Because we have auto key on, a keyframe is positioned at this location. So we're holding our elevation or our altitude all the way to frame 30, and then we start to go up. But we've got another bounce coming. So in between 30 and 60, right here at frame 60, I want to be back on the table. So once again, I'm going to take translate Y and set that to 0. So now, we're staying flat on the table and then moving up in between 60 and 90, which will actually be our last jump. Is this making sense to everybody so far? All right. So now I'm going to move to right in between my keyframes. This is one of the great things about using auto key and keyframing in this manner, is I'm going to move to frame 15 right in between my 2 frames. See, these 2 keyframes at 1 and 30, they're kind of like anchor points. So now if I move to 15, I can lift the cube up into the air. We'll just hit F, and I have my first jump. It's not a beautiful jump yet, but we are getting up into the air. Now I'll go to frame 45, right in between my 2 anchor points at 30 and 60. We'll move up again, maybe just a little bit higher. And I know it's higher because I can use my graph to verify it. Also keep in mind that if you want to get really fancy, you can select these keyframes, and you can middle mouse drag them to move them around. If you hold down the Shift key before you do, you can decide whether you just want to move vertically or horizontally. And in this case, we just want to move vertically. What that's doing is lowering the value. Remember, this graph is like a regular graph from your old algebra class where we have time running across the bottom and we have our attribute value on the left-hand side. By lowering the value in this case, we're actually lowering translate Y, so our block is moving up and down while we move that key, which is very, very cool. Finally, we'll move to 75, which is right during the center of our last jump, and we'll pull the block even higher into the air. So we're getting one last really good jump in. And there we go. Bounce, bounce, bounce. Now, it's not the best looking bounce ever. As a matter of fact, if I hit play, it looks more like it's waving up and down than actually bouncing. And that's because of the nature of this curve. You can actually see that behavior outlined in the curve, where we're gradually slowing down before we hit the table. Of course, bounces don't really work that way, so we don't want to see that happen. By the way, if you're playing back and you're getting something like, I don't know, this, where you're moving really, really fast, and you don't like that, then make sure you right-click on your time slider and go to playback speed and set that to real time. Now, to clean up our bounce, what we need to do is clean up these keyframes. And here's how we're going to do that. I want you to select all of the keyframes where the ball is either hitting the table or landing on the blocks. And with all of this selected, go under Tangents and choose Break Tangents. Now what that allows you to do is to take the incoming curve on one side and make it point in a different direction than the curve on the other side. So we can get a nice point going here. Because when something bounces, its curve will arc down straight into the point and then straight back up again. Just like if you were to draft if you were actually kind of drawing the path of a ball bouncing up and down. Oh boy, here we go with the tangents. Tangents aren't that bad. You have to have them. Unless you want to keyframe frame by frame by frame. At that point, you might as well be doing stop motion. Okay, so I'll start here with the first keyframe. And all I'm going to do is first, in Maya, this is just the way Maya works. It will frustrate you if you're coming to this from other applications where it might be a little easier. You have to select the keyframe, then select the tangent, and then you can use middle mouse button to adjust the tangent. Next, we'll grab our next keyframe. We'll select the right tangent. I know my right from my left. So we'll select the left tangent. So again, we select the keyframe, then select the tangent, and use middle mouse to pull that tangent up. Grab the other tangent, pull that up as well. Grab the next keyframe. Left tangent, lift up. Right tangent, lift up. Last keyframe. Left tangent, lift up. Now, do you see how that more cleanly demonstrates the path that a ball would be taking, or a bouncing object, not to be a ball, would be taking if it were bouncing along a surface, so it doesn't look like it's waving? So let's rewind and let's hit play, and now, boing, boing, bump. Now we have a nice bounce. Super easy. But we want to make things a little more interesting. So what I'm going to do is reset ready statuses, and I want people to get up to this point. I'll go ahead and pause the video for just a moment. Okay, so let's go ahead and continue. The next thing we're going to do is animate the rotation of this block. So we'll go all the way back to frame 1, and I'm just going to hit Shift E, and you'll see that puts down some keyframes for rotation. And here's how this is going to work. I'm going to just scrub forward to frame 30 when we land back on the table. Get my rotate tool out and hold down the J key for discrete rotation, and I'm going to rotate this guy 180 degrees so it's standing on its head. Now if we check out my rotate X curve and just hit F, you see what that looks like. So he's just landing on his head. Now over here at 60, I'm going to hold down J, and we'll rotate it back to 360. So now it's back on its feet again. Boing, boing. See how it's just kind of rotating forward? Now this last jump, we're going to get a little fancy. So we'll go all the way to frame 90, and we'll rotate a full 360 degrees to 720. And there you go. So now if we hit play, we have some simple rotation. And with that, we're actually done with our animation. That's all we're going to be covering. Keep it very simple. Now, if you want to accentuate it and you want to add a little bit of a wobble to the end or make it rock at the end, you want to do any of that stuff, you have the power. For our demonstration, we're going to keep this really simple. Alright, so with that done, we need to move on to adding some lights to our scene so that we can render this out. Because right now, if we hit render, well, in this case, we see the default lighting, but the default lighting is boring. I think we can all agree with that. As a matter of fact, I'd like to render this out with Mental Ray. So in order to do that, you're going to need to go under Window, Settings Preferences, and go to the Plugin Manager. Scroll way to the bottom, and you'll see the Maya to MR or Maya to Mental Ray plugin. Make sure that is loaded and set to auto load. It may already be, but if it's not, go ahead and turn it on, and then click Close. With that out of the way, we can go into our Render Globals, or Render Settings window, by clicking on the little clapboard with the two circles next to it. Then take your Render Using line and set that from Maya Software to Mental Ray. Now I'm going to take my quality, I'm going to go to the quality tab and set this from draft to preview. It's just slightly better. Could you repeat that, please? I'm going to repeat the whole thing. Go under Window, Settings Preferences, and go to the Plugin Manager. So again, that's Window, Settings Preferences, and go to the Plugin Manager. Scroll way down in your plugin window and make sure that you have Mental Ray's plugin activated. That's Maya to MR. Make sure that's loaded and set to auto load. Otherwise, you won't be able to render in Mental Ray ever.
Close?
I am pretty close. We're to the rendering stage.
No, woman's here too.
Oh yeah, that happens sometimes. All right.
How many people showed up?
How many people did show up? Right now we have 15 people in BuzzNet. We have 10 attendees, so, you know, BuzzNet does a little bit. But I think at one point we had about, 15 people in all. The number of people actually following along has gone down and down and down, so I think right now only Sajiro's following along with me. And he already knows plenty of Maya, so I think he's just doing this for the fun of it. Okay, so we have our render globals all set up. So the only thing I want to do is take our quality and just set it to preview. I'm not going to worry about all the crazy settings. I just want this to look a little nicer than it does by default. If we render again, it will take a second longer to render, but you see we've got a little bit of reflection down here in the floor. That reflection is actually perturbed by the bump map and looks pretty cool. It's a little too reflective for my tastes. But if you remember how to fix that, and if you don't, I'll just show you real quick. You can go into the Attribute Editor, select Matte Floor, and then you just need to grab that reflectivity slider and pull it down. Maybe 0.3 might look a little better, but really it's all just a matter of perspective. If you like the really, really shiny floor, then by all means use the really shiny floor. Whatever makes you happy. Okay, so now that out of the way, we need a light. And we're going to keep lighting in this scene very, very simple, and here's how we're going to do it. I want you to go to Create, and go to Lights, and I want you to make a spotlight. Now you won't be able to see where this spotlight is really pointing right now until you hit 7, and even then, because our floor is just a single polygon, even if you take the spotlight and rotate it straight down, you still won't be able to see, and that's kind of frustrating. If you take your renderer and set it to high quality, you'll be able to see that. Barring that, if for some reason your high quality renderer isn't working, then you'll need to add a whole bunch of detail to your floor, because it's going to be vertex based. You basically need a whole lot of vertices across the surface. But if high quality renderer is working, let's just do that. If it's not for some reason, now I feel bad like I've left somebody behind. You can grab this guy, hold down Shift, right mouse, and you can probably get away with smoothing it if we really wanted to. We could tessellate it or triangulate it. Or actually, since we still have the inputs for the polyplane, you can take your subdivisions, and this is nice because of construction history. If I hit 7 right now and I go back to the default quality render, watch this. If I increase my subdivisions in width and height, the more subdivisions I have, the clearer you can see the result of that light, because it's all vertex based. Now I'm going to leave that back at 0 because I think that's just overdoing it. I'm going to switch my renderer to high quality, but at least now you've seen both ways. I'm going to move this up into the air, like so. Let's kind of move it off to one side so the lighting is a little more interesting. We can rotate this a little bit. And we need to change some of the features of this light. So I'm going to take its cone angle and spread it out a little bit. Let's also make sure that it's catching those front blocks really well. So we probably need to move it forward to about here. And then let's take our penumbra angle and kick that up a little bit, and that'll create some softening on the outside. So really all we've done is we've increased our penumbra angle and our cone angle very slightly. I'm also going to scale my floor up a little bit, just so that when we render, all we're really catching is just the edge of the light. Now, if you want to see a little bit out in the distance, okay, like if you don't like everything going out to black, here's a trick you can do. You can go to Window, thank you. Go to Create, go to Lights, and make an ambient light. Now, here's the deal. You want to do a couple of things here. First off, let's move this up into the air real quick. And let's go into its attributes. We have this attribute called ambient shade. Now, with this set all the way to 0, the way this works is it's like a dome of light shining in equally from all angles. You have to be careful because this does have a nasty habit of washing out your scene. And that's what I want you to do. Set this all the way to 0. If you set it all the way to 1, this works just like a point light. Just so you know. So make an ambient light, set its ambient shade all the way down to 0, and then pull its intensity down to almost nothing. So maybe something like 0.075. And now when you render, check this out. You can just make out a little bit of what's going on outside the black. So just a little bit of something cool. Now, I like to do a couple of test renders when I have something animated going into and out of lights, and you can see that our block is bouncing up and out of the lighting, and that's problematic for me. So I'm going to play with my lighting just a little bit to reposition it so that we're taking in all of that motion. There we go. And if we pick a nice angle, maybe something right about here, and just do a quick test render. And there we go. And here's kind of a more downward angle if we need to see that. And at this point, we are officially ready to render our scene. Now, rendering is one of those things that you have to pay a little bit of attention to. If you get lazy at this point, you can run into some problems. Let's go ahead and save our scene, so hit Control-S if you haven't done that lately. I'm going to open up my render settings and go to the Common tab. The Common tab is where you're going to change things like resolution and exactly what frames you want to render. Currently, we have the file name prefix is not set, so it's going to use the scene name. That's fine with me. Image format is going to be IFF for the time being. That's fine. You can, if you are so inclined, render this out to a movie. I do not recommend that you do that. Okay, for a scene this simple, it's fine. But I wouldn't make a habit of it. What we're going to do is take the frame animation extension, and we're going to change this to name.number.extension. That is the Windows standard. Now it knows that you are trying to render out a movie. You can also dig through your output settings here. And if you wanted to change this out to JPEGs or Targas or something, you could certainly do that. For now, though, just for safety's sake, I want you to leave this at Maya as just a regular plain Jane IFF. Also, take your frame padding, since we have 100 frames, and set that up to 3. You'll see what that's doing up here. You can see what the name of the file will be. It'll be workshop_1.0, whatever frame you happen to be on, .iff. We need to make our start frame 1 and our end frame 100. Resolution. Let's change that. 640 by 480 is cool, but it's also boring. So let's do, I don't know, HD 720. Let's do an HD video. Why not, right? Low grade HD, but it's still HD. By somebody's standard. And really, that's about it. If we want to, we can go to some of our extra features and turn on things like motion blur. So there's no deformation motion, but nothing's deforming, so we could turn that on if we just really wanted to. And let me see, if I do a quick test render, it should really slow down the render process. It should take a couple more minutes. But you can see there's already a little bit of blur applied to that block because he's moving, which is pretty cool. Now, for the actual process of creating the render, I'm going to leave motion blur off, and really that's just a decision because I want this to render out quickly for sake of demonstration. So if you want to turn that on yourself, again, it's under features. Take motion blur and set it to no deformation, and you'll have some motion blur, and that's pretty cool. You can take your quality and set that from preview to preview with motion blur, and that will make things look a lot better. But again, I'm going to leave mine low on this end just for the sake of getting a render done today without having to wait too terribly long. Now, all of my render settings are done. I did actually forget something, and Sajiro, actually, before you mentioned it, I was thinking about it. Just saying, we need to turn on some shadows. I just totally forgot about shadows. Sometimes I forget some things. So, it's because Buzz came up here and started talking. So I'm going to select my light, and we don't get shadows unless we turn them on. And since we're using Mental Ray, it's a good idea to use Ray Trace shadows, which I usually set up with the attribute editor. So turn on the attribute editor, scroll down to the shadows panel. Don't worry about depth map shadows, we don't want those. We want ray trace shadows. And just to make things look a little bit nicer, I want to show you something. If we just turn shadows on and zoom in here and do a quick render. Woof, I need to turn down my resolution. You see we get some nice looking shadows, but they could be nicer. And here's how. On my end, I'm going to turn my resolution back down. I hope you guys will bear with me in that regard. But it's just, I need something much smaller to be able to render out. So let's do 640 by, what would that be, 360? So same aspect ratio, just a smaller image so that I can render out my demonstrations without it killing my computer. Yes, there are still two types of shadows in Maya, though ray trace is probably going to be your go-to for most production work. So we're not going to be using depth map. So what I want you to do is take your light radius and kick that up. If we set that to maybe like 0.2, now if we render, we have just a little bit of fuzzing going on around our shadows, but probably not much because we only have one shadow ray. Let's kick this up to maybe 4 whole shadow rays and increase our radius to 0.5 and render again. It's starting to get a little bit better. That's what I'm talking about. 5 is a little much though, so let's pull that down to about 3. That looks pretty good. So you see we've got some softening going on in our shadows. You have to be really careful with this. The light radius does increase your softening, but to make the quality not so chunky and nasty, you need to increase your shadow rays. Now, the chunkiness of the shadows is being eaten up by the texture of the table a little bit, which is very convenient. But 4 is not really cutting it for me. I'm going to kick it up to 8 and render again. And that looks great. I think we can definitely work with that. So let's just find a good camera angle, something that we think looks nice where we can see all of the features. And let's come up here to our toolbar, and we have a couple of things we need to switch on. Let's go ahead and turn on our resolution gate. What this does is this gives you a little rectangle that you need to fit all of your animation into. I mean, if you don't mind something going a little bit out of the screen like that, that's fine. Just find an angle that looks good for you. When you're happy, save your scene. And our last step is actually to create our final render. We're going to do that by pressing F6 to go to the rendering menu set. So press F6, go to render, and choose batch render. Now, you can monitor your render in a whole bunch of different ways. But the way you'll generally want to do it is with either the script editor, which will feed back, or the command line, which should be feeding back right now. But let's go to Window, General Editors, and open up the script editor. And this guy is constantly telling us what's going on. And you see right now, we are at frame 3, and now at frame 4. Now we're also about 1 hour and 10 minutes into the video. So what I'm going to do is let everybody take a quick break, if you need one, while this is rendering, and I'm going to pause the video. I'm not going to stop the video. So here in just a second, the rendering is going to jump all the way up to frame 100 if you're watching the video. But in the meantime, if you're actually attending this live and you need to run and go to the bathroom or grab a drink, now would be a good time to do that. Okay, so at this point, our render is done. Now, there are other things we could do with our render. We could take the frame stack that we've developed. We could change it over into a video. There's a lot of different avenues to do that. We're not going to be doing that in this workshop. Our goal here for the workshop was to give us a final render, but I will show you a way that you can preview it if you want to show it off to your friends. And you're going to do that by way of fcheck. To open up fcheck, just hit the Windows button, and in your run command, your command line, just type in fcheck, and you'll get this window. fcheck allows you to preview any animations that you have created. Just go to File and choose Open Animation. Make sure that you are pointed in the proper folder. So here's our Maya Workshop project. And by default, all of your frames are going to go into the Images folder. And there's workshop_001.iff. Go ahead and open that up. And there's our animation. Now, it was a pretty simple project, but really that's about it for our demonstration for today. So unless there are any other questions, then I would like to thank everybody for showing up and hanging out. And if you guys do have any questions or anything else that you'd like to know about, please feel free to shoot me a PM. Of course, I'm just Zach over on 3D Buzz. You can also feel free to check out the Maya Fundamentals videos, which as member sponsors, you have access to all of them. And all of the content for those is still pretty much valid. And anything that might have been a little bit different, you've already seen the differences as of this video. So that's definitely good stuff. So thank you very much, everybody, for jumping in, and good night all, and I will let you all continue on about your lives until our next workshop or class. Take it easy.